Okay, welcome back to the Rugby League Digest, Part 3 of A Time for Heroes, our in-depth look at season 1994, the calm before the storm. I'm Michael Adams here with Andrew Paskin. How are you, Andy?
I'm good, how are you?
Good. So we spent the last episode going through the squads of Canberra and Canterbury, the grand finalists for 1994, the loaded squads, especially of the Green Machine. This week we're going to be looking at the regular season fortunes of each team, as well as have a look at how the semi-finals progressed.
There's some good teams in that year. Looking back over the notes, I was surprised, teams like Norths and that sort of thing. It was cool.
Yeah, so I got some Norths content at the back end of the show, which I'm sure the Norths fans we have will be happy about that. They don't get much of a Guernsey these days.
Shout out to Flo.
So let's start with Canterbury, minor premiers for 1994. That was back-to-back minor premiers, doing in 1993 as well. In 1994, they really announced themselves early by beating Canberra 17-12 early in the season, courtesy of a Terry Lamb masterclass. And at that point, when he was still healthy, all the usual talk came out about Canterbury being a one-man band or as close to a one-man show as existed in the premiership at that time. So they really had a point to prove when he did go down and spent much of the season injured. We talked about the emergence of a few players in that squad. One we missed last time was Matthew Ryan, who went on a real run mid-season and was even talked about in Origin terms.
He was a really good player.
It's so funny, like, I know the name, I have a picture of him in my head, but I've got, like, no memory of him as a player.
But there's so many guys called Ryan and Bell, and, like, they sort of mix into one. Like, in that era, there seemed to be, like a half a dozen of each of those names.
Yeah.
But he was a really good player.
Yeah, and his name was mentioned strongly in Origin calculations. And it made it plausible for Chris Anderson to say that Darren Smith was being left out of the team on form grounds, saying that Darren Smith didn't give them the strike power out wide that Matthew Ryan did.
Yeah, I mean, plausible deniability, they call it.
So he missed Origin, but he actually played in the Super League Tri-Series for New South Wales, which I wasn't aware of.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of that either.
Yeah, so he had a fair run there. The other big news for Canterbury that year was a partial move to Concord Oval. They played 3 or 4 games there, so-called Waratah Park.
That was a harbinger of things to come for the game in Sydney.
Yeah. So obviously they ended up going to Parramatta Oval the next year when they changed their name to the Sydney Bulldogs. I think they might have even still played some games at Concord. But
remember when I don't know if you remember your age, but when they changed the name to Sydney Bulldogs, that was just like, there was shockwaves.
Oh, yeah.
Just the audacity, there's a few other clubs in Sydney.
But my stepdad at the time was a Balmain fan, and when Balmain changed their name to the Sydney Tigers, he was like, "That's it, I'm done. I'm never watching them again." And little did he know that.
With rugby league fans, like the smallest thing can get a life ban.
Yeah,
a minor name change. That's it.
But we'll have some in-depth discussion about those name changes and those moves away from the suburban grounds as we get into the Super League season proper. So we might halt that there. Another little moment in Canterbury's season I wanted to point out was some sledging in Canterbury's win over Manly, which really announced them as, quotation marks, the real deal. And two Manly players earned the ire of one Martin Bella. Terry Hill, no surprises, and Mark Carroll. So Bella had this to say of Hill and Carroll's efforts. The sledging that was directed at me by Hill and Carroll for the entire game was unbelievable, and I haven't experienced anything like it in my career. I'm not going to bring myself down to their level and repeat what was said, but let's say it's not something I'm going to forget. They thought it was all a joke and that it was just something that could be left on the field. Unfortunately, I feel too strongly about the issue and can't do that. I haven't a scrap of respect for either Hill or Carroll. And he went on to say that he knows he's not the most popular bloke in the game. He said, I admit I'm not liked by everyone, and I know that. I like to judge people as I find them, not how I'm told to find them, and that has probably got me offside with a few people. Personally, I don't give a damn.
I really like Martin Bella. He's an intellect.
Yeah.
For a rugby league player, and obviously, if it's between Terry Hill and Martin Bella, I know whose side I'm on. But yeah, he has to realise rugby league is not just one big foot rot flats episode.
But so that was in the midst of a long winning run for Canterbury. They had a streak of 9 wins at one stage in the season. But looking at their week to week, you could see signs that that they weren't as impressive as that record showed. They were like struggling to get by against weak teams. Late in the season, Canberra actually demolished them.
To quote a local golfer, you don't have to draw pictures, mate. 2 points is 2 points.
Yeah, exactly. But when you have one team steamrolling their way to the semis and the minor premiers kind of limping over the line.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. Am I imagining this, or was it the era of a lot more longer winning streaks, mid-90s? I think with the salary cap, you get like a dud team can jag one back after 4 or 5 losses generally, like a Titans or whatever.
Yeah.
But in those days, you could have like a 14-game winning streak.
Yeah. I think you're right about that. I don't have the stats to back it up. But
you know who does have the stats? One Andrew Ferguson from the Rugby League Project.
Who we've lent on heavily for this episode. So Andrew Ferguson's stats. What was the name I suggested? Fergo's Stat Shack? I don't know. I'm working on the name. But anyway, so...
I think drawing board for that one, mate.
But yeah, so we will get to that later in the show. But so Canterbury, even though they were minor premiers, they were limping towards the line by the end. On the other side of the ball, Canberra, who lost one or two more games than Canterbury over the course of the year, were by far and away the most impressive team throughout the regular season. So there's a few things to get to with Canberra's season. One thing I wanted to start with was a bit of foreshadowing. I'm just going to read this to you. This was in the wake of their 46-16 win over South Sydney in March. Veteran prop Paul Osborne, entering his 10th season of grade football, emerged as the new Bruce Stadium crowd favourite in the Canberra Raiders' emphatic victory. Spurred on by rousing cheers, he was a key contributor as the Raiders trampled over Souths.
Yeah, wow. Love the Aussie.
Yeah, so obviously there's a lot of Aussie content in our next episode where we look at the grand final.
There's obviously a lot of content in the episode where we look at self-serve checkouts.
So we'll save all that. But one thing that stood out to me about Canberra's season is, and I don't think even Andrew Ferguson will be able to get these stats for us, but I wonder if any team has ever had more length of the field tries in a season than Canberra.
Amazing.
So almost every game you're seeing, some match report with a variation of this. Canberra led 22-10 at halftime, but each time Illawarra looked like making a challenge, Canberra shifted into a higher gear. An 85-metre runaway try to exciting winger Ken Nagus being a case in point. Almost every game, whether it's Nagus or Mullins, Nandruku, you're getting some like long-range try out of nowhere.
Well, let me ask you this. Take Brett Mullins and Nagus and Nandruku and Canberra's backline out of this year of 94. Is it even like an outstanding season? Like, that is the centerpiece of the season.
Mm.
Like the 4 tries, the 3 tries, and I think you got 5 tries in one game. It really is. It's that era. So when you think of 94, you're basically thinking of Brett Mullins, right?
Yeah. But again, Nagus especially was just as impressive. In one game against St. George, he scored 2 length of the field tries.
Incredible athlete.
But that Mullins run, so that came in the midst of a 5-game streak of Canberra winning by at least 30 points. The 3 games where he scored his 11 tries.
Cronulla, I remember watching it on ABC Football.
Yeah. Want to have a go at the score of that one?
A lot.
So it was Cronulla 56-12, then South 48-8, then Newcastle 52-16.
Gee whiz.
So 11 tries in those 3 games.
Well, do you remember on our last incarnation of the RLD, the week-to-week show, we were talking about the Hayne run in the Hall of Fame discussion, the famed 2009 Hayne run.
Mm.
That was the next feeling after the Brett Mullins run. Those 2 were in the same class. Those 3 games, and Hayne did it for longer. But when you were just thinking for the whole week, man, can't wait for the weekend. It's going to be an absolute massacre.
Well, let's talk about that because you were there at the 3rd of those games in Newcastle. 4 tries, 2 length of the fields. One of those length of the fields, I think, is probably on the first thing on his epitaph.
Yeah. Well, I don't remember the South one too much. I remember vividly watching the Cronulla game with my nan at her little 5-borough house in Toronto West, and just been jumping up and down and loving it and going, how good is this? And then I was obviously there reeling from the Ricky Stewart snub, but then coming back to cheer on the boys.
Mm. So what was the vibe in the stadium? Obviously, like heavy loss for Newcastle.
Yeah, but honestly, Knights fans are good in they respect good football, and yeah, it was electric. People knew they were in the presence of greatness. Bit of a wanky way to put it, but they actually did.
So in the midst of it was a season of streaks, and one of those streaks was Canberra going through the season at home undefeated, and you know.
Was it a fortress at Bruce Stadium?
An absolute fortress, because their run effectively lasted for 2 seasons, from March 93 until May 95. They didn't have a loss at home.
I also feel like today that the home ground advantage is dissipated.
Yeah.
Probably because no one plays at the home ground. But back then, like especially out of town teams, if you lost at home, it was a major deal.
Yeah. No, that's definitely something that's changed. And even now, like doing my footy tipping, I get caught up in that. I'm like, winning at Canberra on a Saturday night, that's a tough ask, and then the team comes in and wins by 30, But so since 1991, Canberra, until early 1994, they had a record of over 82% at Bruce Stadium.
That's amazing.
In some pretty esteemed company, not too many home undefeated seasons in rugby league history. So since they did it in 1994, Manly went on to do it in 96. Brisbane
Fortress
Brookvale. Interestingly, Manly had a nice little record, going undefeated away in 1995, undefeated at home in 1996.
Amazing.
And then so Brisbane did it in 97 and 2000, and Melbourne, the last team in 2007 to have a home undefeated season.
We're going to get to 97 in Brisbane, obviously, down the track in the series, but that's probably the only thing close to the 94 Raiders.
Well, I don't know, Andrew. I missed that one, so I'll have to catch up when we get to 97. But certainly that 98 and 2000, those Broncos sides were, like, there was never any doubt they were winning the comp those years.
Yeah. So you actually boycotted the grand final.
I think I might have actually watched the grand final, because I remember my dad and my uncle, because it was a Saturday night, right, the grand final.
Yeah.
I remember they were tuning in. My uncle was over, and I turned my face away from the TV, and I remember my uncle going like, just watch it. And so I can't remember if I actually did or if I stuck to my guns.
Your uncle's like this melodramatic fruit.
So it was a highly successful season for Canberra in terms of their attack, leading to talk of them as being one of the great attacking sides. So they set the tries record, but it should be said that the East team of 1935 remained the benchmark for attacking sides. So Canberra scored their tries at a rate of 5.6 a game, 5.8 if you take out the semis.
Dave Brown got 7.4.
Yeah, exactly. So East in 1935 was scoring at 7.7 tries a game. And I should say, we'll do our shout out to Andrew Ferguson now. The Rugby League project, we would be absolutely lost without it. So anyone listening to this who is not aware of the Rugby League project, which is probably close to zero, make sure you're on top of it. Follow Andrew's work at Rugby League Ramblings, some great Rugby League history blog posts. He's got his new podcast, Fergo and the Freak. So we are big supporters of Andrew Ferguson here. So that East team in 1935 won their games at an average score of 37-10. This is in the 3-point try era.
Yeah.
Canberra 94, 31-13 was their average scoreline.
Enormous.
Which is, yeah.
And the defense as well.
Yeah. So obviously they were in a rare class in terms of their attacking prowess. But something that really bugs me in the way that people were talking about that Canberra team, they'd be saying like, Canberra looking to go down as Canberra have a chance of going down as the greatest attacking team of the modern era. It's like, what is this modern era?
Yeah.
Like,
I assume they mean post limited tackle, right?
Well, that's the thing. It's never been clearly defined as to whether that is what they mean. It'd be I could understand it if we all said modern era begins with limited tackle football.
I actually think that they actually mean, when the commentators say it, they actually mean entertainers 1980. Seriously. I think like before that was still a lot of biff and whatever. I think they mean modern eras in the 80s.
Well, I wouldn't.
Winfield Cup.
Yeah, but I wouldn't say the the Dogs of War era was particularly entertaining. You had a trialist grand final in 86, But yeah, it really bugs me that we have to say modern era. Like, people just can't grapple with the fact that something that happened before they were born, exists and needs to be reckoned with.
But in saying that, I get annoyed by it because I just think of them like Dave Brown scoring 9 tries against Glebe or something. It wasn't exactly the tightest comp around.
So yeah, they did have 80-point. They had an 80-point win over Canterbury, a 60-point win over Uni.
That's approaching Mickey Mouse levels of football.
But again, it's not like there were no other good teams in the comp.
I think you're looking at rose-colored glasses a bit there. But I mean, you're right. One era for the whole game.
Yeah.
But it's a bit hard to compare.
But the point is, in that era, no one else, including other East teams of that era where they won 3 straight comps, no one else put up those points that they did in that one season.
Yeah.
So everyone else had the same chance to set those records. They did it that one year, and everyone just goes, one of the great teams of the modern era. Why can't they say one of the the great teams since East 1935?
There you go. That's a better way of saying it.
But at the end, when we have done with the grand final, we're going to spend a bit of time putting that Canberra 94 team against the East 1935 team and against some of the other great backlines in rugby league history, so we can continue the debate there.
What's the best St George backline in your view?
So I think the classic one is
2008 or
64, where you had Langlands playing fullback, you had Billy Smith playing in the centres because it gave you an all-international backline with the exception of George Evans at halfback. So that was probably the best in terms of an all-international kind of thing. When you had Langlands, King and Lumsden, you had Gaznia and Billy Smith in the centres, Brian Clay at 5'8". That's pretty unbeatable.
Yeah. Well, that'd be a good comparison.
But anyway, so we'll save that till the end. And so we'll move into the semi-final. So as I said, Canterbury, minor premiers, they finished on 36 points. Norths were second on 35, then Canberra 34, Manly 33, and Brisbane scraping into the 5 on 27 points. So there was a clear top 4 all season.
I really like watching Norths in that era. From 91 to 95, I really enjoy watching them.
I do too. And in fact, I enjoyed them so much, I've devoted a whole subsection of this episode to discussing Norths. But before we get there, I want to talk about that ladder. So Brisbane, a real struggle throughout the season, but they showed their class by scraping in to the semi-finals. So a real top 4, then a drop-off. I've got to say, it's a very bad look for the ARL going into season 95. So from 9th to 16th, all ARL teams. Balmain finished with 8 points, Gold Coast 11, East 13, West 14, Parramatta 15.
I wanted to bring this up during the episode of the breakaway, but there's one rugby league truth. It's current on-field form dictates everything.
Yeah.
Relocation, stadium building. Doesn't know what indicator you want. On-field form is the indicator. But if Super League had the ARL teams, wouldn't have even got off the ground.
Yeah, no, absolutely true. And really, I think it actually did really build some momentum for Super League having that. There was a definite feeling when you had these super teams and these new clubs coming in that what's the point of playing these meaningless games in Sydney every 2 weeks when you've got these, huge fixtures that you could be playing more often.
Absolutely.
But as I said, even though Brisbane scraped into the finals, they showed their class in the back half of the season and ended up beating Manly in that first semi-final, 16-4, which I think this game really shows the truth of the old idea that you got to lose one to win one kind of thing.
Sure.
So Manly, even though they had a great season and were on the brink of, a dominant era for Manly, in that semi-final, you get like a relatively inexperienced team against a team who'd been there and done it. And at one point in the first half, Manly were parked on Brisbane's line for, the best part of 20 minutes, couldn't break it. Brisbane then went on to just shut them down and go on and win the match. So Brisbane's victory in that first weekend of semi-final football set up one of the great weekends that I remember watching the semis in the game to get into the grand final between Canberra and Canterbury, won 19-18 in extra time. by Canterbury.
That was a killer game.
Oh, it's so good. And the other game was Norths beating Brisbane by a field goal as well.
It's kind of a shame that wasn't the grand final.
Yeah. So you'll notice I missed the first Norths Canberra semi there. I'm going to do them as a package deal a bit later in the show, those two Norths Canberra semis. But so Norths beating Brisbane 15-14, courtesy of a Jason Taylor field goal. 2 field goal victories on the one weekend of football. Before we discuss the Canterbury-Canberra semi, this fact of, both games won by a field goal led to David Page in the Rugby League Week having this to say. The field goal returned to vogue in dramatic circumstances on the big weekend of nail-biters. It seemed the 10-metre rule had brought about the drop goal's demise. With sides racking up big leads, the humble one-pointer had become, pointless. I wanted to do a bit of interrogating that to see if there was any truth to that and to look at the effect that the 10-metre rule had on the way football was played. So on the first point, no, it doesn't seem like it did. So total field goals in the year in 1992 was 41, 1993 was 47, 1994 36. So there was a clear drop there, back up to 47 in 1995, but obviously you had 4 more teams in the comp.
Yeah.
So some truth to it, but not necessarily.
It's not a massive.
It's not a massive drop off. That's something that would probably fluctuate on a year-to-year basis anyway. But what I wanted to do was try to get a feel for the impact that the change to the 10-metre rule had. So I went back to mid-1993 when the rule change came into force. So on the 1st of June 1993, the rule was changed in the international board. And reading the match reports from the next week, it reminded me when we did our discussion on the introduction of 4-tackle football in 1967, how little actual talk there was about it as the season progressed.
Looking back on it, it's insane that you can just change the entire game mid-season and no one gives a stuff.
And so I thought this was that exact same thing, that, it happened and everyone just moved on with their life. But then when I looked into it, what I don't get is that the 10-metre rule had already been enforced as a non-official rule for a number of seasons before it.
It was like 8 to 10.
Yeah.
So it was just basically officialized.
And it was almost at the referee's discretion as to how they were going to call it.
Yeah, so like they were saying the 5 meters is about 9 meters at the moment.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
We'd all go, okay.
Yeah, and then you'd get comments like, Harrigan, he refs a big 10. McCallum has a short 10. It's like, well, no, he refs 12, McCallum refs 8,
As a kid, I used to literally think, like, isn't 10 meters 10 meters? What's going on?
I just love that. He refs a big 10. And the other one was, oh, mate, it was 10 meters for them, 3 meters for us, both of those things seem to have disappeared from the lexicon.
Imagine if a copper goes, like someone says, Sergeant O'Connor has got quite a big .05. you can have point one with him. Is all right.
And it led to comments in the press like this from Debbie Splain in 1992. What about referee David Manson? He allowed that Harrigan tackle, made it a defensive game by ignoring the unofficial 10-metre rule, etc. It's like, just make the rule official then. Don't bag a ref and not like. So
that's why it was pushed through so easily because it was already done. But just the fact that it's mid-season just blows me away.
So I was going back to try to find how early I could find reference to a 10-metre as opposed to a 5-metre. So the earliest I found was like 1987. So maybe older listeners than us could tell us any of their experiences or their memories of it.
I seem to remember it being like 5 meters-ish in 92, though.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I think this not being an official rule means that it seemed to be at a referee's discretion.
Yeah. But by the time it came through officially, everyone knew that the 5-meter game was dead.
Yeah. And it did, once it was official, it did have a marked effect on attack, on the way football was played.
I can specifically remember the quick tap was in vogue.
Yeah.
Post 10-meter rule.
Yeah.
It was like, plenty of time to attack, so, let's keep rolling on.
Yeah. So looking at the average points a game over those next few seasons. So in 1992, you had 32.93 points a game. 1993, 33.92. Up to 40.75 in 1994. And then 42.33 in 1995. So it definitely had an effect. And now, 20 years later, we're still in that same, 41 in 2016 and 2017, 40.73 in 2018. So
I tell you what I equate the 10-meter rule introduction to. If right now they had some sort of official clampdown on wrestling again in the ruck, everyone would go, okay, thank God.
Yeah.
It's here. 5 years overdue. So that's why I went through so quickly.
The other thing I thought about with the 10-meter rule, you were getting a lot of talk at the time of, this is really going to open up the game. You're seeing attacking sides thrive while more conservative or more kind of textbook kind of teams struggle. Does it seem like the defense always catches up? Like anytime there's an attacking innovation or it looks like we're getting a more freewheeling style.
Absolutely. And then it's always the same thing. We need to bring back fatigue for the little man.
So yeah, just interesting that the 10-meter rule and looking at its impact.
You're so right though. Like, and then we'll get into it in Super League how far it went the other way.
But so Canterbury Canberra extra time win to Canterbury 1918. I remember watching this game so clearly. I'm pretty sure it was Daryl Halligan at the end who climbed into the stands to see his family, but I remember that. I hated Canterbury, so I hated seeing that, and I was devastated that Canberra lost. Like, this was such a good game of footy. And it made me think, like, I think in rugby league, the way we talk about great games, if it's not a grand final or an origin game or the very occasional test, it just kind of seems to get forgotten in the memory.
There's so many great semi-finals.
Yeah.
That you're right. It's just being like whitewashed.
And I feel like in American sports, you have all these moments that are like mythical moments in like the NFL particularly. You'll hear about the immaculate reception, the catch, all these moments. And so few of them actually occurred in the Super Bowl. Yeah. They all were in some conference final or, some earlier game.
I want to say in rugby league, making the semi-finals isn't that prestigious. Like making the 8, it's good, whatever. But if you don't make the grand final, it's like,
yeah,
what a waste.
But so this game was such a good game. So Canterbury were ahead for most of the way, and then David Wesley actually scored the equalising try with 30 seconds left or whatever to take to extra time.
I mean, after this one, I wasn't happy about it being a Raiders fan, but I appreciated the game, obviously. But I was really worried going into the grand final because of this game. Really?
Because Canberra were like my second team, like growing up. Like my dad was from Queanbeyan, so they were always like the family second team. So in that era, I was always like, behind Canberra to win the grand final if they were contending. And I remember grand final day just being so confident that Canberra was going to win.
I remember going, Lomax is out. Jesus, we lost in the semi. What's going on?
And a lot of talk in the wake of Canberra's eventual grand final win that this semi-final was Canterbury's grand final.
It was a case of having extra gears to go to.
Yeah. Canterbury got up in part by some inspirational leadership from Terry Lamb. Gave a rousing halftime speech, apparently, which got everyone fired up. Ended a 9-match winning streak for Canberra, so they looked unstoppable heading into the finals, and this really kind of gave those question marks that you spoke of then.
The old rugby league adage is, is it better to have an easy runner or a few tough ones,
Yeah, which can be proven on both sides. Like
because it's absolute rubbish.
It's funny, I watched the game 1 of the NBA finals the other day, and in the aftermath of the Warriors losing, Steve Kerr was interviewed about like whether the extra break hurt the Warriors. And he just said, doesn't matter. If we'd have won, everyone would be saying that the break kept us fresh. Doesn't matter, So.
It goes across sports, that ridiculous adage.
So as I said, Canterbury, the first team into the grand final. Norths would have a rematch with Canberra, who beat them in that first semi-final. And you touched on it. This was a really great era for Norths. I really like this Norths team. And it's not something I really realised at the time, but now when I was putting this together, looking back, I was stunned by how much I liked this Norths team.
They built a really, really great football team.
Yeah.
From like 1991 onwards.
Which is a credit to them because of their position in the Sydney Rugby League landscape. So they made their last grand final in 1943. Since then, up until 1994, they'd made the semis 8 times in the 50 years since that grand final appearance. So they finished third in both 1991 and 1982, but since they finished second in 1965, they finished no higher than sixth in any other year in that time period.
It used to annoy me when the commentators would always bring that up. They haven't won a grand final since. Give them a break.
But so many times you see, like, it'll be like an article in 1990 and it'll be like, no one's kicking sand in the faces of Norths anymore. Like, this is a different Norths team.
It's such a shame for them because if it wasn't for the Canberra juggernaut green machine, they would have been in the GF, is the thing.
Yeah, and I always think, so 96... St. George, my beloved St. George, beat them in the preliminary final, went on to lose to Manly. Like, I wish I could give them that losing grand final appearance, like it wouldn't really mean anything to St. George fans, and it would mean so much to Norths if they could say they lost another grand final.
In terms of rugby league clubs and their extracurricular businesses, I think North should have been in the bridesmaids business, selling dresses or something.
So I had a bit of a look into the history of Norths and their rise in the early 90s, and I wanted to turn to friend of the show Noel Kelly, who coached them for a time in the 1970s. And I think Kelly's observations of the Norths mindset really hold true throughout much of their history. And I hope Norths fans don't think of this as just us shitting on Norths, because that's not what we're here to do. So Noel Kelly said that I was to stay for 4 more seasons at that most friendly of clubs, and right there in those words is North Sydney's problem over the years. I've got to say that I've never met better blokes in my life than I met at North Sydney, but the truth of football is that it's not always the real good blokes who make real good footballers.
There you go.
And then he said, the worst thing about the Bears was their ready acceptance of defeat. We might play okay and not lose by much, and I'd walk into the room and there'd be officials with their arms draped around players' shoulders. A great book by Andrew Moore, the club history of Norths, called The Mighty Bears. It had that same kind of acceptance of defeat and, all right, we're never going to win it, but we can be proud that we made the semis.
It's odd, isn't it?
Yeah. One of my favorite quotes was talking about their rise in 1990, where they looked good for much of the season, ultimately missed the finals. But Andrew Moore said this: as it happens, the Bears did not make the semi-finals that year, though the team only fell out of contention 3 weeks before the conclusion of the season. So a lot of their emergence in the 90s was down to their chairman, David Hill, who really went a long way towards setting him on this path of success in the 90s.
So much, especially at the lower end of the clubs, depends on the top end of the administration.
Yeah.
Just getting stuff done properly.
Yeah. He also waged a one-man war against the New South Wales Rugby League for their cigarette stance, which led to the Bears lost their major sponsor, New South Wales Health Department, going into 1994 because of their issues with the New South Wales Rugby League. What does that say about we've lost the Department of Health?
What were they doing sponsoring rugby league in the first place?
It's odd, isn't it? So North started 1994 on a real hot streak. Went into it as the April premiers. Again in Rugby League Week, David Page said this: North Sydney have sealed their first premiership since 1992. Too early to start predicting what will happen in September, perhaps, but history leans heavily in favour of that outcome. Penrith opened their 1991 campaign with 7 straight wins, like North this season, and went on to win their first premiership. Went on to list a series of stats that indicated why Norths were specials to go on and win the whole thing, which they failed to do, of course, but very impressive early in the year. Also impressive early in the year was St. George. When they met at the end of April at Cogra Oval, it was a top-of-the-table clash. Friday night, a game I was at and remember so clearly. Norths ended up winning at 9-2, and it's one of those games like Origin intensity where you feel the hits from the sideline. I'm not good at remembering score lines of individual games. It could be a game last week and I'd struggle to tell you what the score is, but I remember this game so clearly.
Well, that's an odd score.
Yeah, it is an odd score. And both teams went on a sustained losing run after this match, so I think it really took it out of both teams.
Right.
But Norths went on to recover. St. George went on to lose 61-0 to Manly, among other lowlights.
That squad, the Bears squad of that year, so they had Taylor come in,
Yeah.
replaced Halligan. So they had the two best goal kickers year after year.
Yeah.
That was in an era when other teams had 40 to 50% goal kickers and it was acceptable.
Yeah.
And they had 70 to 80%.
Yeah.
So it was a huge advantage.
So I want to talk about that squad because, as I said, I really like so much of that squad.
Back row to die for.
Yeah. You mentioned Jason Taylor. Let's start with him. Among the most maligned players of the last 20 or 30 years.
And from our old show, the Week to Week show, I was always trying to defend him when he was a Tigers coach because I think he gets a bad rap because of his appearance.
I was going to say, my theory on Jason Taylor is he has the male equivalent of a resting bitch face.
There it is.
He just looks really unlikable.
and I think he's a nice bloke from all reports. So we're death riding this bloke's career for no reason, rugby league fans.
But so because I knew we were going to be talking about North, so I sent word out to the biggest North fan that we know among our listener base, at @PaulMac_78 on Twitter. Good rugby league follow.
I highly recommend him.
Get on top of that. But so I wanted to get his thoughts on that 94 team, any memories he had, or, whatever he might have to say. And one of the first things he said was that I never really believed in Jason Taylor. I already knew at 16 you needed a great halfback and not a good halfback to win a comp.
I think that's quite astute, but he wasn't a great halfback. He was a very good halfback.
I was going to say, he was better than a good halfback. I thought he was a very good halfback.
Definitely rep level second tier.
Yep.
Worthy.
Yeah. But not a winner.
No, but I mean, it was more like he didn't have the physical attributes of some of the guys, and probably the killer instinct.
Yeah.
Playing in a dinner suit, that sort of thing. Great organizer though, which so many halfbacks in this day and age haven't even got organizational skills.
No, exactly.
So,
yeah,
it's a premium.
Yeah, but that concept of being a winner or not a winner, it's a very it lacks any nuance. It's not really descriptive of what actually happens, but there's something to it.
There's definitely something to it, and I'm reluctant to comment on it because I'm a loser. It's like, so I can identify it because I haven't been able to achieve it. It's just it's an aura almost.
Yeah,
it's like Michael Jordan winner, Ben Hunt inverse winner. Yeah.
But it's fun. I think when you get burnt by a player a couple of times, you fear them, and I definitely, going for St. George in the 90s, I feared Jason Taylor. He was a very good player. Yeah,
I always liked a good kicking game and a good passing game. That's why I really liked him. But look at a guy like Ricky Stewart, winner. Yeah. Just pure, I don't know what the word is, mongrel.
Yeah.
Just mongrel inside the brain. That's why I said that's why I think Jason Taylor is a good bloke. He hasn't got that mongrel.
But back to Paul's point about you need a great halfback to win the comp. I think much lesser halfbacks than Jason Taylor have won multiple comps.
Well, it's not a great halfback, it's a great half, a great leader, organizer. So if it's the sixth, if it's Barr doing the organising, that's your halfback.
Well, let's talk about the six. Greg Florimo. To me, Greg Florimo and Jason Taylor, I could have easily seen that duo winning a comp.
That was Florimo's peak year.
Yeah.
94 was his ultimate peak.
Yeah. Made the Kangaroo Tour that year. Yeah. Still wasn't getting picked for Origin. I remember in the playground at school, Mr. Gibbs, who won later fame by sticking a pencil up Robert O'Dowd's nose in geography. But Mr. Gibbs had the paper. He was looking at the New South Wales team list, and he saw Brad Fittler's name, and he said, "Hitler, why are they picking him? Florimo's better than him."
Hitler?
Yeah. I remember even at the time going I don't know, I think Fittler's pretty good, but I think Florimo wouldn't have been out of place.
He was considered, I remember my cousin describing him as an eager beaver, right? So he had this sort of reputation as he's overachieving out of his talent or something, but he wasn't really.
No.
He was a really bloody good player.
Yeah, and he rose to any level. He was never out of place. He played tests on that 94 Kangaroo Tour and, slotted in perfectly.
And he also developed as a utility there. He wasn't a utility before that. But off the bench for the Kangaroos, he was great.
Well, let's talk about his utility value in latter years. I think one of my favourite running jokes we have on this show is Flo's undying efforts to revive the Bears.
Which is admirable and hilarious.
It's so admirable. I've recently been dealing with a guy who's doing some work in the North Sydney archives, which are housed in a very poor state. And he comes up to me and goes, "I told Greg Florimo he was disgusted." I like to think of Flo getting on the floor and going, "Mate, we need some Mylar sheets. We need some archive boxes."
I picture Florimo like sort of hibernating, and then when there's ever a chance of like a license coming up, he sits up like the Undertaker.
But I can see why he would be such a hero to Norths fans, like the actual hometown kid, like grew up in Willoughby or wherever.
But how good is it having an actual one club player?
Yeah. And I think I've said this before, like, as a fan, what you want is to know that a player on your team cares about your club as much as you do.
Yeah, and in that case, more.
Yeah. But it is so relatively rare, especially, over the last 20 or 30 years.
Yeah.
But I love Greg Florimo.
This is sort of like the post-Peter Jackson era where he was the focal point of the attack.
Yeah.
And a bit more serious, I'd say, was the vibe of that team.
Mm. And you had, blokes like Mario Fennick who knew it was his last chance to...
Well, you want to talk about winners.
Yeah.
He mightn't have won much, but he had the winner's mentality.
Yeah.
120%.
Yeah. And was really kind of pulling them along as they got into those semis. But that pack in itself, like, he had Dave Fairley winning the Rothmans that year, announcing himself as one of the best second rowers in the game. Billy Moore and Gary Larson both at their absolute peak. You also had the emergence of Matt Sears, who won the Rookie of the Year that year, or Norwich Rising Star as it was at the time.
Well, I'll tell you what, he was my second favourite player after that 94 season.
If you want to talk about a meteoric rise and fall, like it never got as good for him as it was in 94.
The only person that ever compared to his running and tackle break style for me was Brian Carney at his peak. They're both built close to the ground, really fast across the ground, but strong and bumping off guys.
Yeah.
Geez, he was a good player in that series.
So you could really see a sense that they had the team, and if not this year, they had the team that was going to be competing and, a real shot at winning it for the next several years. I want to talk to you about Peter Louis, who won Coach of the Year that year.
Love Peter Louis. Things
were going so good that he quit his job as greenskeeper at Woy Woy Bowling Club to coach the Bears full time.
He had that hair with the Brill Cream hair that looked like an RSL board member.
Yeah. So he was 49 in 1994. At that point, the oldest coach in first grade.
I thought he was 60 then.
Yeah. But that's crazy to me. 49, he's the oldest coach in the game.
Crazy. Getting Coach of the Year, that was up there with Phil Economides getting it. Like I really like the guy that had a bad squad getting it, or a bad club.
And especially when you had the next year, the loyalty payments to Bozo and Gus and Mal Reilly, like Peter Louis just kind of like got left out of any discussion of the best coaches in the game. But I mean, he did a lot with that team. So to those semi-finals, so Canberra won the first one 26-12 in a game that was closer than that scoreline indicates. That game was, of course, the famous moment of Matt Sears running down Brett Mullins.
Yeah.
So Ray Warren's commentary of that moment, that's it, that is it, they couldn't possibly catch Mullins, which, of course, Matt Sears went on to do. But watching that highlight recently, like, Matt Sears was so close to when Rab said that. It was, like, way premature.
Bloody quick, though.
Yeah. So apparently Brett Mullins wasn't quite at full fitness. I think... You can see it when he made the break. I think a few weeks earlier he would have made it easy.
Yeah.
But a great iconic moment for Matt Sears.
Yeah.
But in the end, it probably would have been better off if he let Mullins score, because shortly after Chris Caruana was sin-binned for a professional foul, Canberra went on to score 3 tries while he was sin-binned and, put the game out of reach.
I seem to remember Chris Caruana always being in the sin bin.
I think you're right, because remember in that era, you'd get the paper on the Sunday or whatever and look, and they'd show you the stats, and Sinbin was one of the stats.
Yeah.
I seem to remember seeing Chris Caruana
leading the league in Sinbin.
So they beat Brisbane, went on to face Canberra for the right to make it to the grand final, which I was at that game, that second semi-final.
Were you?
Yeah. It's so funny. I said I don't really remember individual games that well, but I still remember where I was sitting and the buzz, and it was such another really bruising physical game that Canberra won at 22-9, but again it was a very tight game, and a really entertaining game as well. So John Lomax gets sent off, and North's in with a real shot from there, and then minutes later Gary Larson goes off as well, the first time in his career. In their win against Brisbane, just reading this, I'll just read this out. One player who needed his confidence buoyed before the game was State of Origin back rower Gary Larson. Larson was down on himself following the loss to Canberra and was desperate to put his best foot forward against the Broncos. I knew I had to get involved early. I didn't against Canberra and the game just passed me by. I wonder if that was in his head going into that second semi-final, going like, I've got to get involved here, and maybe
certainly. And brain explosions.
Yeah, and going back to Andrew Moore's book, he called Larson's spear tackle a so-called spear tackle. and watching the replay of that, it's so-called a spear tackle because of the fact that he picked him up in spear-like fashion and drove him into the ground.
Here's a good rule of thumb. If anyone's got the word spear tackle near your tackle, it's not a good tackle.
Yeah. So those two send-offs were a real turning point in that game. One reason is that Billy Moore didn't go off when he was hit by Lomax, but had to go off at a later state. And because he didn't go off instantly, it cost them an interchange.
Right.
And so at one stage late in the match, North did really well because half the team was like busted. They were playing it with 11 men at one point because they'd run out of interchanges. So winger David Hall went off at one point because he was injured. And former skipper Tony Ray, in a great clubman kind of show, like ran into the tunnel and basically said, "You got to get back out there," which he did. So as I said, Norths did go down 22-9, but won themselves all the admirers in the game with their performance and their season. And
it's easy to say that they never win anything, but who's going to beat that squad?
Yeah.
It's like the Golden State Warriors in NBA. It's the last 5 years. It's like, if you can beat them, it's a miracle almost. So
there was a real feeling with that Norths team that they'd announced themselves and they were now genuinely one of the competition heavyweights, which, I mean, for the next few years, they did very well, but always just lacked that. Well,
they were shouldering quite a bit of the ARL comp on their shoulders.
So. Yeah, and as we'll see, once we do get into the Super League season proper, they played a surprisingly influential role in the Super League war, given their place in the game, historically, and the way they were so easily kind of tossed aside as it reached its conclusion.
Probably that tossing aside after the ill-fated Northern Eagles venture, which I had some personal experiences with, that's probably left the most bitterness out of the entire war.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
Seriously.
And it's funny that I find North Sydney fans are probably, like, anecdotally, this is a very small sample size, but they seem the least likely to boycott the game forever. They've either found a new club or they're, pushing North's barrel and, still holding out hope.
Well, I've got different experience.
Really?
I live on the north side.
Yeah,
and every old bloke I meet that used to be a North Sydney fan, a good proportion of and watched the game since Super League.
Yeah, right, yeah. So I'll defer to your experience living in that area. But, it astounds me like all the Balmain and West fans are like, no, I'm done. It's like, you've got kind of a team still. But I'll leave the last word to Phil Gould in 1996 in that preliminary final against St George, when it was clear St George were going to win and go on to the grand final. Phil Gould said, "Don't worry, Bears fans, there's better days ahead." So that's our show this week. We'll be back next week to go through the grand final in full. As always, would love to hear any feedback. Send us an email to the rugbyleaguedigest@gmail.com. I'm actually getting really addicted to getting those listener stories about their memories of Super League, what they were doing at the time.
Some great ones come through.
Some really good ones. So please, if you've got the time, let us know your thoughts. I found that it seems that the majority of our listeners are our age plus or minus a few years, but I'm getting some really good emails from people who are too young to remember Super League, and I'm loving getting that perspective. And
growing up in the only NRL era, it must be crazy because it's been quite smooth sailing.
Yeah.
Apart from the scandals, but I mean, the actual game has been smooth.
Yeah. So, as I said, would really love to get some more of that feedback. So do send us an email in, hit us up on Facebook and Twitter. And if you do have the time and can give us a review on Apple Podcasts, that would be a really big help. We're loving the people who have been spreading the word for us, and this is one of the best ways you can do that. So we'll be back next week with the conclusion of our 1994 special. So we'll speak to you then.